So it's an honor and a privilege, a pleasure to be joined by Nathan Schlueter. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is a professor of philosophy and religion at Hillsdale College. How are you, Nathan?
I'm doing great, Sean. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I should like to begin by congratulating you on another successful academic year at Hillsdale. Yeah,
Thank you.
must be really exhausting grading those exams and papers.
It is difficult work grading philosophy, writing, and reading, but it's also edifying
Mhm.
when you see the fruits of your labor. So it's a mixed experience.
So, how did you come to be teaching at this prestigious institution?
I came in a somewhat circuitous way, I suppose. Yeah, I suppose a backstory would be that I always wanted more than anything, not always, but when I had my awakening to a love of philosophy and really with philosophy, literature, theology, politics, my goal was to just be in a place where I could keep reading these great books and living among these ideas and find someone who would actually pay me to do that. That was the gold standard for me. And so seemed like academia was a route that could bring you close to that. So I was teaching at a small Catholic university in Iowa, which was near where my parents are from and my grandparents were. And I was there for 3 or 4 years, and then a friend called me who was at Hillsdale at the time, still is, in 2004, and told me that the college was hiring for 2 positions in politics because they were launching a new constitution class. So this was right at the beginning when the college was making some big changes in its curricula. And so my wife said, you should at least apply and then we'll see what happens from there. So I applied and was hired into the politics department in 2005. And I helped to design and implement the first constitution class
Mhm.
that was taught as part of that curriculum. And then through a series of various events, I was invited to teach some courses in the great books classes. That would be for the English department. The English had the great rhetoric and great books classes, and because my PhD was in politics, literature, and philosophy, it was a very unique program. We can talk about that later if you'd like.
Mhm.
Maybe we should, because it might be interesting to your listeners or viewers. So I started teaching the great books classes as well, and I loved that. Homer, Virgil, Dante,
Mhm.
and on. And then I was invited to teach some intro to philosophy classes because there was a need there, which I felt like I was in heaven doing. That was just what I wanted to do, Constitution and great books and philosophy. And then I was eventually invited to join the philosophy department full time
Mhm.
because there was a need there, and I was fitting that need pretty well. So in 2011, I I joined the philosophy department full time, largely to do their kind of great books philosophy class, and then to deliver the sort of what you might say the politics side, the human side of the philosophy department. That is ethical theory, social and political philosophy, philosophy and literature, and now the latest course that I've been doing, philosophy of love, sex, and marriage.
Mhm.
So I've been here since 2000, really in this department since 2011. The college has changed a lot in the last 15 years. As you may know, it's still the same college, but it's become more focused, more um, more national in its reach. I think the for a variety of reasons, we've attracted better and better students every year who are really attracted to
Mhm.
the curriculum, the mission of the college, and what we're doing. So these kids are really, really impressive young people, and I feel really honored. I feel very grateful and honored to be here and to be part of the institution.
Yeah. So, I read a piece somewhere, I think it was The Economist, that says that Hillsdale is one of those higher institutions where um, high school graduates, brilliant ones, would choose as an alternative to some of the bigger name universities that even we Vietnamese know. You got your Harvards and your Yales and your Stanford, and it is particularly because it the college emphasizes this education based on the U.S. Constitution and the great books, which I think are essential into being a good American citizen.
Right. I think that Hillsdale is becoming a competitor for, I guess in the US, we tend to call them the Ivy League
Mhm.
institutions or the sort of top, tier one schools. I think we're fully competitive with those schools now for a lot of really talented young people. Not, I think it's partly because of the quality of the whole core curriculum. I did a sabbatical year at Princeton, and I had a great time there. I'm so grateful for that year working with Robbie George there and some of the others in the James Madison program. But I was surprised to learn that they don't have a core curriculum. It's kind of a smorgasbord. It's sort of a buffet, and you can just select what you want off the buffet, and that really flatters. It's very flattering to maybe an 18-year-old to be told that you get to just choose whatever you want to study. But I think um, one level removed from that, a more thoughtful 18-year-old knows better. They don't flatter me. I don't know anything. I
Mhm.
need some guidance. And I think that's the right way to look at it. How many other um, areas of the world do people go into where they are given just sort of unlimited choice, whether it's a trade like carpentry or electricians or engineers or mathematics? They tell you you've got to apprentice yourself to people that know. So if the liberal arts really are an art, they have a tradition and a body of knowledge, and you have masters there who initiate you. So I think a lot of the university, that America did in the world, I think, of humanities and liberal arts at a certain point in the 60s abandoned that notion of a tradition and body of knowledge for a kind of notion of freedom and autonomy, as
Mhm.
so often has happened in the West in the last 50 years, celebrating this kind of unlimited autonomy. And I think young people have suffered for it, and they know it. They know that they've been that this has not really worked to their benefit. And so I think Hillsdale really has done a great job of attracting young people by the highness of this mission. Hey, there is a body of knowledge here and things you need to know to be an educated human being. We believe that the best that's been thought and said exists for a reason.
Mhm.
And we're going to offer that to you, and you're going to work hard. And if you just have some faith and trust, and that you're going to take, it's going to pay off for you. You're going to love what you're learning here. You're going to love the friendships that you build around that way of life and learning. And you will really be set up to succeed in the world if you get this kind of knowledge. And so for someone like me who went to a state school that uh, had the newer model, I didn't know any better. My parents didn't know any better. Um, I look back at those 4 years with resentment. a good deal of resentment. They ask me for money all the time. I don't give them a dime because I don't feel a great deal of gratitude for what the institution gave me. It was just scattered, and it was hit or miss, and there wasn't a lot of guidance. And I see what these Hillsdale kids are getting, and I really, I don't envy it in the sense that I'm not dwelling on my feelings about this, but I do in a different way really envy what they're getting. I'm so happy for them.
Mhm. I think one of the essential books that anyone who's like going through higher education right now, either college or university, should pick up is Alan Bloom's is The Closing of the American Mind. I mean, he well, he names examples of American universities, but all Western universities apply. And I believe in that book he makes arguments that the move away from the core curriculum or of the liberal arts and the move to specialized subjects have let students be unmoored. And contemporary recent criticism, which I think Bloom would add to if he lived to this day, is that um, the Ivy League schools, from what I've heard, been uh, was it moving their objectives into training future political activists rather than good American citizen. So you you produce a great number of what disillusioned and disaffected, indebted, of course, um, well, professionals with a very unmoored knowledge of, well, the American creed, of course, and the Western canon, and basically they contribute to all the political, hubbub that we see to this day. Um, so, of course, I find Hillsdale to be one of those remedies for it. And let's take a look at one reason why, and that is your free course in philosophy, Introduction to Western Philosophy. I'm glad you mentioned Robert George, by the way. He's a great Thomist, which is a follower of Thomas Aquinas, as well as a great constitutionalist. And we've
And a great
started,
banjo player.
of course. And we begun this conversation talking about Thomas Aquinas, specifically that painting of yours. And going through the philosophy course, I believe you spend the most time discussing him and the philosophy of natural law. But let's not get ahead of ourselves because, well, I thought of asking you why we should study, well, Western philosophy, but instead, a better question would be, well, you started the course by not discussing a piece of philosophy, but a work of art. That is by the great Renaissance painter and one of the Ninja Turtles, Raphael, and that is the School of Athens. And so perhaps to answer the question of why should we study Western philosophy, do explain the significance of that particular great painting.
Yeah. So just to back up for a moment, I appreciated you mentioning Bloom's book, and I could digress on that for a while, but I did want to let you know that that book was a very pivotal book for me as an undergraduate in college. I was ill the summer of my junior year. I was on a trajectory. I'd changed my major 3 or 4 times. At that point, I was in social studies, secondary education, bored out of my mind by the kind of almost infantile methodological emphases and you could already see the kind of progressive ideological biases in the way it was taught. But I was sick over the summer, and my mother got the audio book of The Closed American Mind, which she maybe listened to the first 2 audio cassettes. If your audience knows what those are, they'll have to go back and look, but they're on audio cassettes. And so I was sick. I listened to the entire book in bed, recovering, and that was just a life changer for me. that awakened in me a kind of deep desire to know that world that he was talking about. It's a remarkable prophetic book, and he's such a talented writer. And while one could criticize things in it, it has proven itself even more so now than in 1986, 87 when he wrote it. It's pretty much what we have seen today with the identity politics and woke and the woke social justice movement. Bloom is already anticipating so much of that and seeing the dangers there. So just wanted to point that out. Raphael's painting, The School of Athens. Well, I use that in part because if your readers or viewers here I encourage them to go do a Google search and look it up if they've never looked at it. Raphael is really trying to capture the entire Western intellectual tradition in that painting. And it's fun trying to identify who the various philosophers are, their poses, the conversations they're having. But at the very center of that painting are Plato and Aristotle, having an argument, and there's a sort of arch behind them, framing them. And I like to point out that Plato, when I teach my course, the students want to get in arguments over who's better, Plato or Aristotle. And one of the points here is that the Western philosophical tradition is not just a monolithic subservience, dogmatic subservience to things that people say. It's characterized by a very live, extended argument through time. It's not just preserving corpses. What's amazing is how alive and even electrifying these thinkers are. And right there in the middle of the School of Athens, clearly Plato and Aristotle are arguing with each other. And Plato's, pointing up to the forms, and Aristotle has his hand out. It's not clear if he's pointing down or if he's pointing to something between a hylomorphic hand point, if you will. But they're clearly discussing some matter of metaphysics and ethics. Aristotle is actually carrying his Nicomachean Ethics in his hand. So that's wonderful to see that conversation happen. In the videos in my class, as you know, I describe that as when my students want to argue about Plato and Aristotle, I say that's like arguing whether you'd rather have one eye rather than two eyes. And what the two eyes give you different, they have slightly different visual fields. They show you different things. And our brain is able to sort of integrate those two eyes into a kind of stereoscopic vision, which gives us depth perception. And that's what I think, in a way of thinking about Plato and Aristotle. What I did not say in my class is that if you go to the Raphael room, Raphael did 4 paintings. He was commissioned to do 4 paintings. This room is just in the vestibule, if you will, to the Sistine Chapel, where another Ninja Turtle is doing his own work of art, his own thing on the ceiling, Michelangelo. But in the Raphael room, just opposite the School of Athens, is another painting, which is also one of my favorites, called a Disputation, Disputatio. It's a disputation on the Eucharist. And you've got a bunch of parent theologians looking up at a monstrance, a Holy Eucharist, and a monstrance up on an altar. And they're clearly just trying to figure out what is going on here. And I think to understand the Western philosophical tradition, you need both of those paintings. You need the world of faith, as that has been elaborated through the Christian tradition, and the world of philosophy that you see in the School of Athens. So I don't think in the course that I talked about the disputation, I can't talk about everything and had to cut out a lot, but I wanted to tell your audience that when you mentioned Aquinas, and Aquinas exemplifies the very best of this tradition in the sense that Christianity is a very singular religion in the sense that it wants to see a basic harmony between the claims of faith and the claims of reason, and to see them not reduced one to the other, but holding one another in a kind of almost like a Gothic cathedral being kind of buttressed and held up to point us upwards to something beautiful. So I thought that would be good for your readers to know that.
Yes. Of course, the painting itself, the School of Athens, represents the unification of art, science, religion, and philosophy. Of course, the painting itself is located in the St. Peter's Basilica, along with, of course, Michelangelo's glorious Sistine Chapel. And I believe that a theme within your course, Intro to Western Philosophy, is how the ancients, Plato, Aristotle, and the medieval Aquinas being one example, seeks to, well, emphasize this unification. And of course, the modern and postmodern tradition, which seeks to divide or divorce this emphasis, this unification. And of course, now that we should mention Thomas Aquinas, and the more I read about him, the more I realize that the more I know that he belongs to a great medieval tradition of philosophers who rediscovered and revitalized Aristotle in order to reconcile with revelation to religion. You have Maimonides for Judaism and Al-Farabi on Islam. And I know that previous Christians or Catholics have always been Platonists, but now Thomas Aquinas taken an Aristotelian viewpoint. So do elaborate on this, how St. Thomas managed to reconcile, well, what we would call a pagan philosopher, a great but pagan philosopher, with monotheism, specifically Christianity.
Great question. So if you don't mind, I'll just riff on a few things you said. It is interesting to note that on the on the archway behind Plato and Aristotle is the inscription Cognitio Causarum, which is Latin for knowledge of causes, which is really a reference to Aristotle. So maybe Raphael's deep affinity is more for Aristotle than for Plato. But Aristotle characterizes philosophy as a, well, love of wisdom. As I try to teach my students, it's the literal etymology, the love of wisdom. But then I ask, well, what kind of love? And what do we mean by wisdom? And wisdom is a distinct kind of knowing. It's knowing the first causes, the ultimate causes, maybe the first cause in the singular, if we back it up all the way. Whereas every other discipline that we know of hives off some domain, some aspect of reality, and gives it its attention, whether it's physics, chemistry, biology, history, English. They're taking some aspect of reality and giving it exclusive attention, and that's perfectly good and appropriate, I think. But what makes philosophy what it is, and to some degree theology as well, is it's unification, as you said, this attempt to see how all of these disciplines or aspects of reality are related to one another in some unified way. And so I think you're right that modern philosophy makes a turn in parts, an analytic turn in which the whole and the unity is broken up into parts, and the whole is lost sight of. And then the nature of the whole becomes deeply problematic. near the end of that, and that's where we are today, thinking, I think, thinking once again about what the whole might be like. Now, back to your question about Aquinas. What I think it's so important to notice what you notice, which is the novelty of Aquinas's work with Aristotle and how deeply controversial it was at the time. The books of Aristotle that Aquinas is interpreting are had been lost for centuries. That we over 1,000 years there were no manuscripts of Aristotle's metaphysics or his physics or his ethics. We knew about them secondhand, and we find them through the Crusades. Just strangely, right? How does this happen? The Muslims want to crack down in Jerusalem. However this emerges, I'm not an historian, but these disputes over the dominion of Jerusalem as this holy city leads to the Crusades, and the Crusades lead to an encounter between the West and Islam, and in that encounter, the West are rediscovered in the hands of these Muslim thinkers, scholars, philosophers, these books of Aristotle that they have had for 2 or 3 centuries. They're translating these Greek texts into Arabic, and they're commenting on them. And so they're brought back to the West, and that makes them doubly suspicious, not only because they have been retrieved from Arab and especially Muslim hands, but also because, as you mentioned, the sort of dominance of Plato up to this point. So what Albert the Great, Aquinas' teacher, is doing and initiating Aquinas into is deeply controversial, given how set Plato had been in the curriculum. And so Aquinas and Albert the Great and others are faced with a kind of a monumental challenge. I want to emphasize that Aquinas is dealing with, he himself does not know Greek. He's dealing with translations, Latin translations by William of Merbecki and others of Aristotle's works, which is to say that you don't necessarily need to have finesse with the original languages to have a deep contact with the ideas. I think there's some consensus that although Aquinas did not know Greek, his commentaries on Aristotle are held still in very, very high regard, even in translation. But what does Aquinas find in Aristotle? If we follow G.K. Chesterton's treatment of Aquinas, The Dumb Ox, this famous biography, which I really recommend, what you get is a kind of appropriation of the truth of the incarnation. That's fundamentally what Aquinas is bringing, and you see that in Raphael's painting. This reappropriation. There's always maybe in Platonist Christianity, I think there is always a kind of Gnostic temptation, a temptation to see the body as possibly something evil to be escaped. You can see why we're tempted, right? Our bodies are such, there's a reason St. Francis calls it brother ass. It's finite, it's vulnerable, it's flatulent, it's smelly, it's we've got to wake up, brush our teeth, look at ourselves, and it's going to die. And so there's this sort of tendency within Platonic Christianity to escapism and repudiation of embodiment. And I don't think that's intrinsic to Christianity by any means, because Christianity affirms that incarnation and repudiates Gnosticism. But it's a tendency that without Aristotle anchors that incarnation philosophically. He provides an occasion to re-examine the incarnation and to appropriate all the reverberating dimensions of embodiment and to affirm the goodness of human embodiment. And I will just point out that I think Aquinas does not, just to be clear, he does not repudiate the Neoplatonic tradition. In fact, what he does is he fuses them. He does not discard Dionysius the Areopagite, or he's very hesitant to disagree with Augustine. Aquinas cites with favor Augustine all the time. So it's not as though Aquinas is trying to leverage one against the other. I think he's allowing them to sort of mutually correct and deepen and influence each other. But he's condemned by the Bishop of Paris for heresy. And he's under the suspicion of heresy for many years in his lifetime. And by the way, why I want to emphasize that point is to say to reemphasize what I said earlier, is that the Western philosophical tradition is not just a sort of dead handing on of dogma. These questions are, I know that there are some Thomists today who maybe are prone to treating Aquinas very dogmatically, as if he must be the last word on all things. And the very first thing we do, it's sort of the sola Thomistica, or the sort of Thomism of the strict observance. Like, let's go see what Aquinas said. And it's not because we think he might be particularly insightful about the domain, but because he's an authoritative voice. And my view is that that's a mistake, to treat any of these thinkers simply as authoritative. If you read St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae, the style of that scholastic disputation is so wonderful. You state the objections of your opponent first, and you state them as fairly and accurately as you can. And then the first response, you do cite an authority. You make an argument by authority, but then you make all the reasons and arguments past the authority. That is, Aquinas knew that arguments by authority are necessary in some ways. They can be helpful, but they're the weakest form of argument, that the beginning of going into the depth and mystery of being, not the end point of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, of course, we've heaped high praise on Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, but of course, Plato deserves some love and credit as well. And of course, from learning your course, I find that every philosopher after Socrates, I think Plato and Socrates we can treat as sort of like one entity for the sake of argument, that every one of them seeks to address the problem or the allegory of the cave, and that begins with Plato, with Socrates. So in I guess reader or listener friendly words, how can you explain the cave, and how can you explain the efforts in which later philosophers, basically the entire Western philosophical tradition, in trying to reconcile it?
Yeah, great question. As you know, I go into that allegory in quite some depth in the video course. I will first say, make clear my view that Plato was not a Platonist. And I tell my students that Plato is not a Platonist. That is, the students of Plato founds this school called the Academy. And the students of that academy, I think, become increasingly sort of dogmatic about metaphysical claims that are in the dialogues, whether in a skeptical direction, or really sort of extreme skeptical direction, or just a systematic metaphysical direction. Whereas if you read Plato's dialogues themselves, they are magnificently kind of playful, nuanced, speculative. Plato, the various characters are offering arguments. Plato is perfectly aware, for example, of the criticisms of his theory of the forms. He puts them in the mouth of Parmenides and others. The best arguments that Aristotle makes against Plato's theory of forms, he's pretty much getting all of them from Platonic dialogues. So I think Aristotle knows he's not really targeting Plato. He's really targeting, I think, Platonists who almost turned the metaphysical system into a religion. And I'm thinking here of Plotinus and others who then become an influence on Augustine, down the road. Now, having a metaphysical system, trying to piece that out, I think, can be really important and a good exercise, but I think we just have to be careful about it. And the allegory of the cave is in Plato's Republic, the dialogue Plato's Republic, and I think it. I would say that it is meant to capture at least two basic kinds, maybe three basic kinds of reality. The first one, if you know the story, is that human beings begin as prisoners. Socrates describes it as the human condition, in which there are prisoners chained down, staring at the walls of a cave, and then somehow, at least for one of them, not for all of them, significantly, what would happen if the chain were broken, and then the person is, at some point, it's even described as dragged out to the next level, in which there's a fire, and there are various figures described as puppet makers, who are casting images onto the wall of the cave. So that's all the prisoners know. And then there's another move from the realm of the fire up outside the cave, where then the prisoner sees what is taken to be the full truth about reality. And that finds its focal point in the sun, which is Plato's Socrates describes as the idea of the good, which is the source of intelligibility, and even at some points he describes as a source of being itself. And so it's meant to give us a picture. So what is this picture of? First of all, I think it's meant to be a picture of the degrees of being or existence. And that claim is sometimes taken with some quizzical looks when I say that to people. What do you mean degrees of existence? And so what I sometimes will do is hold up a mirror to a picture, like, for example, a mathematical object on the chalkboard, and I'll say, well, what do you see in the mirror? Oh, I see a triangle. And what do you see on the chalkboard? A triangle. And I'll say, well, which one is more the triangle? And they will say the triangle on the chalkboard has more being than the triangle in the mirror. Why? Well, the mirror is merely reflecting what's on the chalkboard. Okay, so now you get two levels of being there to some degree. You get the mirror, which is reflecting, and so it has more superficially gives us what is being reflected, the thing itself. And what you get, and suddenly, if you reflect on that, wow, actually, we can keep running that exercise deeper and deeper, and we find that reality is deeply layered with like a mirror aspect, and then we can keep going deeper and deeper into the basic, like, what is a triangle? Is a triangle on the board even the real triangle? No, I can erase it. Did I just erase a triangle? No, triangleness still exists, even when that image on the board left. And how did we know the triangle? And you see how you can keep running this back to what? The first causes, the first principles that are the most unchanging and eternal. So the allegory of the cave gives us that depth of being. Secondly, it shows the human education with respect to that depth of being. How do human beings come to know reality in this depth? and beginning with the most superficial and then moving to the most deep. And there you get a real human drama. And I think it's a very, very suggestive drama. It's Socrates himself calls the image an image of education and our want of it. And the word education, by the way, I think has its roots somewhere in relation to the allegory of the cave, because the Latin suggests, educere, to lead out of, and I say, lead out of what? To lead out of the cave. That's what a true education should do. What does that mean? It means to lead us from taking superficial, our mirror images of reality, leading us from there to understanding the sort of true, unchanging depths of reality. But what you notice in this education is that there are moments in which this is very unpleasant and difficult for the prisoner to turn from taking what we take to be reality superficially to something deeper. Initially, is like a plunge into darkness. That's how Socrates shows it to us. It's as if I ask my students, have you ever been in a dark room and then someone just flipped on the light? And so my kids always say when I wake them up in the morning, I come in, time to get up, kids. They say, don't turn on the light, don't turn on the light.
Right.
And why not? Because it's painful.
Mhm.
Wow, light is painful initially because our eyes have to accommodate to us. Our physiology needs a gradual way to move from darkness to light, and I think our minds do too. So the moral temptation,
Mhm.
the moral temptation with respect to learning is to prefer the darkness to the light, to prefer the sort of dark superficial to the light of depth. And so that education involves a kind of, Socrates describes it as a kind of turning of the soul, not just putting things in your mind, but slowly turning your soul from dark to light as you make your way. So that in itself can become a long conversation. But then the third reality of that allegory, I think, is that we don't make this journey ever alone as just individuals. We all are just find ourselves embodied in communities, and especially in political communities. And those political communities are comprised of people that have shared opinions about reality. And opinions, as Socrates understands it, is not simply false. Opinion is kind of a belief about something, but you don't really know the sort of causes or depth of that belief. You only know it in a kind of superficial sort of way. Excuse me, Chung. It's my wife trying to call here. See if we can prevent that a little longer. So what happens is that when you have a association of people organized around these opinions, and you get someone challenging those opinions, because it's hard to turn and it's painful to turn from that darkness to light, you get resistance and even anger. And this is precisely what we see happen in Athens. Socrates is challenging the opinions of those who are around him. And at a certain point, they get very angry. And as you know, he's ultimately put to death for challenging the city. And this happens in the allegory of the cave. The prisoner goes out, he gets out, and then he goes back in. And he goes down to those prisoners and starts trying to tell them, oh, there's, reality is different than this. There's sunlight out there. There's real trees and apples. And what you see now is nothing like what's out there. And they get angry and they tell him to shut up and they silence him and then they threaten to kill him. Mm-hmm. So the third reality is that there is a kind of, is Socrates, Plato, through that allegory, really wants to bring out how delicate and complex the relationship is between knowledge and society.
Yes. And the way I see it, Western philosophy, I believe, is divided into three major periods: ancient, modern, and postmodern. And to summarize it, they all are concerned with, well, how to get out of the cave, or whether it is good to get out of the cave. Uh, of course, we've talked about the unification between among art and science, religion, and philosophy. And the ancients, they believe in that unification, and that is how we individually get out. And the moderns, on the other hand, they seem to believe that one or more of these are actually our shackles. Either it is religion or it is art. And in one of the clips, with the bonus clips in the course, you've mentioned that if there's a modern take on Raphael's The School of Athens, the two figures standing at the center would be Francis Bacon and René Descartes. Bacon would be pointing downward, and Descartes would be pointing to the south. I'm assuming Bacon would be standing on the left and Descartes would be standing on the right. So perhaps to summarize the modern philosophy tradition, uh, can you explain why you've, I guess, pictured the moderns to be like so?
Thanks for reminding me of that clip. I'd forgotten that I said that. That's pretty good. Putting Bacon and Descartes into the sort of garb, because I do think that they are those two early modern philosophers both share some deep similarities. They both, unlike previous to them, repudiate the previous tradition of philosophy. They both think they're doing something very novel and very new. They are both very eager to know in order to control nature, in order to gain mastery over nature. The technological project is very important to both of them. And yet the way that they propose to do this is very different. Bacon, like being the sort of Englishman that he is, takes he might take Bacon as a what's one way you could put it, a hyper Aristotle. Aristotle thinks that all knowledge begins with the senses, but he doesn't think knowledge is limited to the senses. He thinks we have intellectual powers to see through, to know through our senses certain non-sensory features of reality. It's the forms of things, the essences of things. But Bacon also, he's Aristotelian in the sense that he thinks all knowledge begins with the senses, but he's modern and founds really what we call empiricism, by saying we cannot go beyond what the senses deliver. We're not warranted in doing that. We have to be very slow and attentive and not go beyond that, certainly not prematurely. And whereas Descartes then is our hyper Plato, if you will. And Descartes I think, how is he different from Plato? I guess he's like Plato in the sense that, or he's like Platonism, less than like Plato, as I mentioned earlier, in the sense that Plato sees that sensory knowledge is really quite fallible, that to really limit yourself to the senses is going to be a dead end ultimately if you follow that line of reasoning. But Descartes is not really willing to, he really takes a kind of skeptical method all the way to the extreme to see what's left. And he arrives, as you know, at, well, even if I'm wrong about everything, there must be an I there that is the subject of all of the error. So Descartes really kind of tries to get it like an I err, therefore I am. I'm wrong, therefore at least there's one thing I know, and it's my own existence. And he tries to refound all the rest of philosophy to some degree on that, beginning with that I and making his way. So, but between the two of them, Bacon and Descartes, you need them both. You need kind of an I, which is autonomous and sovereign over nature, and then you need that material world that you can manipulate and control. The two of them help kind of launch a project in which sovereign, autonomous human beings have a kind of complete mastery over a matter that's understood, a nature that's understood really as matter and motion. So their goals and projects are very different from the pre-modern philosophers. I would say that, so, and is there a knowledge of causes? Like what would the inscription say behind both Descartes and Bacon? I think for both of them, plausibly, it would say, know in order to control. It is knowledge that they really ultimately want practical knowledge. And I guess I would say that I want to kind of make the point that I think along the way, Bacon and Descartes do uncover, at least negatively, certain aspects of reality that we would not have known about if they had not launched those projects. I think it's important to have a certain sense of gratitude to them for that. There is a way in which they keep that Western tradition of philosophy quite alive. Their objections, as they proceed along the way that they do, they open up a whole sets of questions and problems that you can't just ignore naively and pretend that they're not there. Some of their, arguably, their pathway leads us, say, to quantum mechanics, to general and special relativity, ultimately, not to mention Newtonian physics and these other things. And then which can't be simply false. These ways of thinking about nature, I don't think they can be simply dismissed because they're different than Aristotle, and they create real challenges for a genuinely postmodern philosophy. Now, I say Nietzsche, who is kind of credited with launching postmodern philosophy. I'm with this philosopher Peter Lawler, who calls Nietzsche hypermodern. He's not postmodern; he's really hypermodern. If the sign behind Bacon and Descartes says no in order to control, that's Nietzsche to the extreme. Like there is no, there's just only control. All knowing is just a making. Human beings make reality, and this is the kind of final endpoint we get after Bacon and Descartes. So what we today call postmodernism, I think, is really just hypermodernism. It's taken the premises of Bacon and Descartes all the way to their conclusion. So a genuine postmodernism would really be an alternative to modern philosophy. It wouldn't just accelerate all of the premises. It would actually offer us something actually very, very new, which drew upon the best of, I think, ancient and medieval philosophy, but was unafraid in encountering the challenges of modern philosophy. And I think so. It's in my view, it's an exciting time in a way to live and to think about how we put together what I think is a genuinely kind of, if you will, neo-Aristotelian insights about reality and realism, essences, forms, etc., and apply those in a way that also at least take some of the things that have come out of modern philosophy.
Yes. of course, because of the limits of our time, I would have to apologize to David Hume and Immanuel Kant because we're not really treating them right now. I mean, I think to even explain what Kant was talking about would take us like a day or two. So let's, let's compare and contrast the two final thinkers that you addressed in your course, which is Friedrich Nietzsche, the German, and C.S. Lewis, the Brit. Um, a few words about Nietzsche. I mean, every time I think of Friedrich Nietzsche, I kept my mind just keep reminding me of Paul Daniels' character in Little Miss Sunshine, where he takes a vow of silence and then he reads Nietzsche. And of course, before we began recording, we've conversed about the new atheists, and I think of the four of them, Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, and Dennett, none of them would explicitly say that they are Nietzschean, and they would say that they do have a, they do harbor a great distaste for Nietzsche, but atheism, their brand of anti-Christianity is Nietzschean. It was Nietzsche who posited these arguments and articulated them for generations to come. And so I see, so Nietzsche and C.S. Lewis, I find, and again, this is stereotypical image about like the atheists. They are sort of associated with people between the ages of 14 and 18, often dudes, and they would clutch a copy of what the God Delusion or Beyond Good and Evil and think they are smarter than the rest of humanity. I mean, I sort of know that because to an extent I was one of them, and I'm glad that I'm not that person anymore. But the way I see it, or at least the way that you've treated these two thinkers, Nietzsche and C.S. Lewis, I find that they are confronting the same set of problems, and in their own brilliance, they've articulated those sets of problems really well. Nietzsche's solution, he's many things, but one of the adjectives you cannot attribute to him is humble. So his set of solutions are pretty much outrageous and and very much out of the box. Wherein C.S. Lewis, well, his solutions are much more grounded in the ancient unification that we've talked about. So I've noticed this when you've mentioned the Nietzsche's example idea of the last man, as well as C.S. Lewis's image of man without chest. They are essentially similar images. So would you mind shining a light on how Nietzsche and C.S. Lewis differently addresses the same problem of, well, man without chest, or the last man, so to speak?
Right, great question, and obviously it's a big one. I would begin by maybe trying to think about how Nietzsche and Lewis are similar, just to shake things up a little bit, because I think that just as Plato was not a Platonist, Nietzsche is not a Nietzschean. And I think that some of my reading of Nietzsche I actually get from Alan Bloom. When you read him in The Closed American Mind, Bloom treats Nietzsche as a surprisingly sympathetic figure. Nietzsche, who is not who is an atheist only in this sense, that he thinks that modern philosophy and modern science have killed God, that this is a trajectory, and in Nietzsche's view, this is in some sense tragic, because human beings have a deep need to live a meaningful life, to live in a unified cosmos. And modern philosophy, that's what he means by God, I think. Generally, I think by God, Nietzsche doesn't just mean a personal being. He means a world that is intelligible and ordered, and has some place for human beings. It is not just an accident. And so Nietzsche um, sees, you know, so for one thing, when Nietzsche declares, God is dead, he's not gleefully celebrating that God is dead. He's basically saying, you killed God. Bacon, Descartes, Hume, Kant, you're the ones who killed God with your form of philosophy. And now we've got a big problem on our hands because human nature abhors a vacuum. Man will anything rather than nothing. And um, and how we think about living a meaningful life becomes now hugely problematic and important. And Nietzsche, I think, would then have contempt for the new atheists because their solution is this very rationalistic, scientific kind of approach to reality, which simply can never feed spiritual desires that Nietzsche believes in. Nietzsche thinks our humanity really is constituted not by ratiocination or computation, nor by passion, just by instinct and animal appetite, but by our erotic longing for meaning, for truth, for story. I think Nietzsche saw life of the imagination as being hugely important to human flourishing and happiness. And the new atheists just want to cut that out entirely. They want human beings to live this sort of just very practical, pragmatic, scientific life. And I think Nietzsche saw that was going to lead to a diminution of human beings to just mere animals, like what Lewis calls trousered apes. That's ultimately what the upshot of the new atheists would be, is just make us trousered apes. Think about that, like just animal appetites using technology to feed our appetites.
Mhm.
So I think that Nietzsche and Lewis share a similar concern about the tendencies of modern philosophy and modern science and technology. Where's the difference? Well, they both want men with chests. They think that the chest is this location that is the most genuinely human part of our nature. And again, not just our ratiocination, not just our appetite, but this space of imagination where we think and see in some kind of way through narrative and story. Now, Nietzsche thinks that the story, because he's given up on any notion, because Nietzsche accepts that there must be this deep conflict between story and truth. I think he thinks truth must be this sort of propositional, systematic, scientific reality, and story is always going to be subjective and made up and whatever. And so Nietzsche doesn't think there's any way out of this. He thinks we just have to make up stories, and they have to be just really good stories that the Ubermensch is going to be the great storyteller who's going to save us from this condition in ways that I think you're right are kind of fanciful and even frightening. But I think Lewis, the pivotal moment in Lewis's life is when he sees that stories can be true, that this wedge between story and truth is a false one. This is the big conversation he has with J.R. Tolkien, when Lewis himself is kind of a scientific atheist. He loves stories, but he thinks they're all fake. And he loves truth, but he thinks it's only scientific truth, and he can't bridge them. And it's Tolkien, in this story that they go on a walk or something like this, and Tolkien convinces Lewis, shows him that myth can be true and can express some depth of reality that is not accessible by scientific knowledge or merely story. And that's the turning point for Lewis, I think, is to see that our imagination and storytelling accesses dimensions of reality that are truly meaningful and real and true, and that this is the story, as I use that word, story of philosophy. So in some ways, this is the difference between Nietzsche and Lewis, is that Lewis, Lewis famously describes Christianity as the myth that became fact, but does not cease to be a myth. That always makes my students so nervous. Christianity is a myth. Like Lewis had no problem saying Christianity is a myth. It's just a fact too, but it's a myth, it's a story. And if you don't come in contact with a story, you're going to miss the reality. So I think that in a way brings us all the way back to Plato. Plato only writes dialogues. That's all he left us. What is a dialogue? It's a dramatic story. Why didn't Plato write treatises in philosophy? Why didn't he write systematic metaphysical things? Because I think he saw that story gives us access, brings us in contact with dimensions of reality that mere story on the one hand or mere scientific inquiry on the other can't. So that is like really a condensation of a lot.
I think as you were talking, I keep thinking of ways that we can bring this to a close. It has been a magnificent conversation. I think a thinker that you did not include in the course, but who carries much significance, is Leo Strauss. And as you were explaining the differences and similarities between Lewis and Nietzsche, I keep thinking about Leo Strauss, since of course the great Alan Bloom is a Straussian, and so does the president of Hillsdale College, Larry Arnn. I think the antidote to well, a lot of postmodernist thinking can be found in Strauss. And from my reading of him, what he has concluded is that well we actually do need this grand unification that is a recurring theme of this discussion: philosophy, science, religion, and art. Of course, he has concluded that philosophy, if unmoored from revelation, is gonna leads to doubt, and of course to the abuse of reason that we've seen in the 20th century. And science without ethics or values would also would lead to rationalism and pragmatism. And I think of how one of the most shameful episodes of what you would call modern science is eugenics. And it was the religious people, it was Catholics, who most vehemently oppose it. So I guess to conclude this lecture, conversation, discussion, tell us about Leo Strauss and your reading of him. And I guess maybe you can judge whether my assessment of him is true and whether we do need him in our time or.
Yeah, that's a big question. So I was in graduate school, I read a lot of Strauss because there were some of my teachers were students of Strauss, and I was really learned to appreciate Strauss's just subtlety of thinking, his elegance, his eloquence, his care and insight into the texts he was interpreting have been so valuable to me. But I think I have since, if I can say it, I've moved beyond Strauss. I think that Strauss ultimately, he sets Jerusalem and Athens. He's not seeking, he sees them as fundamental alternatives rather than a harmonious unity. And so Jerusalem and Athens, our faith and reason, are ultimately, two options that one can take, but neither one can refute the other, but they remain in some sense always at odds with one another. And I think that Strauss's religion, if you will, was on the side of philosophy, on the side of Athens, not on the side of Jerusalem. And so I think Jerusalem is always treated, that way of framing the problem, I think, always ends up being having deeper problems in other ways. there is a way in which faith, when it's inside philosophy, it can corrupt philosophy in certain ways, but it can also enrich it and deepen it. And so I think there are dangers in how Strauss appropriates faith. And that shows up to some degree, I think, in an impoverished view of the natural law or natural right, in the way he depicts the natural law. And whether he thinks there are exceptionalist moral norms inside the natural law, it's very unclear whether he does or not. He certainly kind of distances himself from sort of more Thomistic views of this. And then I also think that there are problems in his view about how philosophy and history are related to one another. And my own view is that Strauss is very worried about radical historicism, which limits thought to which makes thought purely historical rather than thought being transhistorical, related to things that are permanent or necessarily true. But I think his allergy for radical historicism maybe led to a more hostile view to history more generally, and the way that human knowledge does, I think, really develop inside history, inside tradition. So I, at this point in my life, look more to thinkers like Alasdair MacIntyre or Michael Polanyi as being sort of really powerful alternatives to postmodern philosophy. I see them as offering, in some sense, clearer paths out, ways they are aware of and deal with problems that I think Strauss maybe overlooks. But that would be like a longer conversation, because I'd want to make adaptations to them. But I think like MacIntyre, for example, is convert to Catholicism, and so he doesn't read faith into everything, but he has it. He's got that perspective and sees, and you see that manifest in the philosophy. And he has a sense of history and how history has to play out with philosophy in a way that I think is in the right direction. I have since knowing MacIntyre and Michael Polanyi, I don't know if you know Polanyi's work at all, but I think he's pretty remarkable. But I have since found that what MacIntyre and Polanyi are both doing are actually really present in the writings of John Henry Newman. And so in some ways, where this is not fully developed, okay, but I think, wow, Newman really is where the game is. Newman really combines realism, a kind of faith, sense of history, empiricism, like it's all there, but it's unified. He gives us a direct, in my view, Newman points the way out, and there's great work to be done, as I keep telling my students and the graduate students here, go to Newman. You will, there's so much waiting to be done, good work to be done here. So that's my long, short answer to your question.
Well, with that being said, Nathan Schlueter, thank you very much for guiding us through this 1,000-year history of Western traditional philosophical thought. And I'm sure that this will serve as a great introduction to your introduction to Western philosophy course. And again, I cannot thank you enough for being on this show. I wish you all the best of luck in your future endeavors, and I hope you take care of yourself.
Thank you, Chung, and thanks for having me on this program. And I wish it all success. And thank you again.
Yeah, and happy Memorial Day, by the way. I don't know when it is, but well, still.
It's coming up a week from Monday, I believe. So thank you.
All right, awesome.